He was a millionaire who had everything: money, power, and fame. But one night, when a hungry young woman asked, "May I have your leftovers, sir?" everything changed. What began as a simple act of kindness turned into a life-altering moment neither of them could forget. Stay till the end, because this story will remind you that even the smallest gesture can spark the biggest miracles. The rain was soft but relentless that evening, a thin mist blanketing the busy city streets like a memory that refused to fade. Cars splashed through shallow puddles, headlights glimmering like restless fireflies, while inside the tall glass buildings, life continued with its usual rhythm: laughter, clinking glasses, and music too soft to hide the silence in between. Inside one of the city's most elegant restaurants, the Marlowe, a man sat alone by the window. His name was Ethan Cole, a name the business world respected, even feared. At 45, he was the face of success. The founder of Cole Enterprises, he owned companies, estates, and more than a few newspapers. His name was printed in magazines beside words like visionary and self-made. To anyone who passed by, he was the man who had everything. But tonight, Ethan didn't feel like a man who had anything at all. He sat with his elbow on the table, his chin resting on his hand, staring blankly at the half-eaten steak in front of him. The smell of roasted herbs and red wine sauce filled the air, but he could barely taste it. He had ordered the most expensive item on the menu, out of habit, not hunger. Food no longer satisfied him. Neither did victory, nor praise, nor power. He had just come from a meeting that had lasted all afternoon, one where dozens of employees had lost their jobs. The board called it strategic restructuring. Ethan called it what it really was: cutting corners. He'd argued against it, but numbers always won in the end. The investors cheered. The stock went up. And yet, as he sat in that warm restaurant surrounded by laughter and comfort, he couldn't shake off the image of a young man, one of those recently fired, shaking his hand earlier that day and saying quietly, "It's all right, sir. I understand." That understanding hurt more than anger would have. He sighed, leaned back in his chair, and ran a hand through his dark brown hair, already streaked with grey. Outside the window, the rain glistened under the streetlights. Couples walked by, huddled close under umbrellas. For a moment, Ethan envied them. Their simplicity, their togetherness, their lack of worry about markets or meetings. He lifted his glass of red wine, but didn't drink. His phone buzzed once, then twice. He ignored it. The notifications were from his assistant, reminders about tomorrow's breakfast meeting and an event he'd promised to attend, but secretly dreaded. He silenced the phone and placed it face down on the table. Then, just as he began to sink back into his thoughts, the restaurant door opened. A brief gust of cold air swept through the room, and the murmur of conversation dipped for a moment. He didn't look up at first, not until he heard a small, hesitant voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir. May I have your leftovers?" The words were soft, trembling, yet steady enough to be heard clearly. Ethan turned his head slowly. A young woman stood near his table. She looked barely in her 20s, her hair damp from the rain, strands sticking to her pale face. Her clothes were simple: a faded grey sweater, jeans that looked worn but clean, and a small torn bag slung over her shoulder. Her shoes squeaked faintly against the marble floor, but it was her eyes that made Ethan pause. Not just the tiredness in them, but something deeper. A kind of quiet strength. She didn't look like someone begging. She looked like someone asking for dignity, not pity. The waiter noticed her immediately and started walking over, clearly ready to escort her out. The restaurant was high-end, filled with people who paid for privacy and luxury, a place where interruptions like this simply didn't happen. But before the waiter could say a word, Ethan raised a hand. "It's all right," he said. His voice was calm, deep, and carried authority. The waiter hesitated, unsure, then nodded and stepped back. The girl lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry," she murmured, clutching her bag closer. "I shouldn't have come in. I just saw you were finished, and I thought maybe—" Ethan's heart twinged with something unfamiliar. Guilt? Empathy? He couldn't tell. All he knew was that he didn't want her to leave. "Sit," he said softly. She froze, looking uncertain if she had heard him right. "Sir?" He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down." For a moment she hesitated, glancing toward the waiter, then back at him. The warmth in his tone seemed real, but she had learned not to trust kindness too easily. Still, there was something in his eyes, tired, maybe even lonely, that made her believe him. She nodded slowly and sat, careful not to make noise as she pulled out the chair. The waiter returned with a questioning look. Ethan nodded again, silently asking him to bring another setting. The waiter obeyed, though his eyebrows furrowed slightly. A few nearby diners glanced over, whispering quietly behind their menus, but Ethan ignored them. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lila," she said after a moment. "Lila Thompson," he nodded, repeating it in his head. "Lila, that's a nice name." "Thank you, sir." She spoke softly, her voice carrying both humility and grace. "You're not from around here, are you?" She shook her head. "No, I came here 2 months ago. Thought I'd find work. Turns out it's harder than I thought." Ethan didn't reply right away. He studied her face, young yet worn by struggle. Her fingers fidgeted slightly on the edge of her napkin. She wasn't used to attention, let alone from a man sitting in a place like this. When the waiter returned, Ethan surprised him again. "Bring her something warm to eat," he said. "Whatever's best tonight." The waiter blinked. "Sir, Ethan's calm gaze stopped him mid-sentence. "It's fine." "Yes, sir," the waiter said quickly and left. Lila's eyes widened. "You don't have to do that," she said quickly. "I wasn't asking for—" "I know," Ethan interrupted softly. "But you're cold, and I don't like eating alone." That earned a small, shy smile from her, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and disbelief. "You're very kind, sir." "I'm not," he said simply, looking down at his untouched steak. "I just haven't done anything good in a while." They fell into a quiet silence again, but this time it felt different, not uncomfortable, just still. When the food arrived, Lila waited until he nodded before touching it. She ate slowly, carefully, as if each bite was something sacred. Ethan found himself watching her, not with pity, but with admiration. There was grace in her simplicity, in the way she whispered "thank you" to the waiter, in how she tried to hide how hungry she really was. "Where do you live?" he asked after a while. "Nowhere fixed," she said, not meeting his eyes. "The shelter was full tonight." "It's all right, though. I'll find somewhere dry." "You'll freeze out there," he said quietly. She shrugged. "I've seen worse nights." He wanted to say more, to ask why, to tell her he could help, but something in her calm acceptance stopped him. She didn't want pity. She wanted respect. When she finished her meal, she folded her hands neatly on the table. "Thank you," she said again. "You've done more for me than you know." Ethan looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You don't have anywhere to go tonight, do you?" She hesitated, then shook her head slowly. He leaned back, thoughtful. "Then come with me." Her head snapped up. "I'm sorry?" "Just for the night. I have a guest house. It's warm, safe." Her eyes widened. "No, sir. I couldn't possibly—" He raised a hand gently. "Please, think of it as a payment for reminding me what kindness looks like." For the first time that night, Lila's expression softened completely. And though the rain outside still fell, something in Ethan's world quietly began to change, not with noise or flash, but with the simple act of a stranger asking for leftovers. That small, trembling question would become the spark that changed everything. The next morning began with a pale, misty light spreading across the horizon, the kind that made the city look gentler than it truly was. Ethan Cole stood by the tall window of his penthouse, a cup of black coffee in hand, staring down at the quiet streets below. He had barely slept. The night had been long, filled with thoughts that wouldn't leave him alone. The girl, her trembling voice, the way she'd said thank you, as if it were the rarest word in her vocabulary. It had been years since anyone's presence had unsettled him like that. He was a man who negotiated million-dollar deals, faced ruthless competitors, and signed documents that could change lives. Yet last night, he'd found himself hesitating in front of a young woman who had nothing but dignity and the kind of courage that came only from surviving too much. He turned when he heard the faint sound of footsteps. Lila stood by the hallway, wearing the same grey sweater as the night before. It had been washed, neatly folded by the housekeeper, but it was still thin for the cold morning. Her hair was dry now, falling softly around her face, and her eyes, those quiet, watchful eyes, met his with hesitation. "I didn't want to wake you," she said softly. "The lady downstairs gave me some tea," Ethan nodded. "You slept well?" She nodded. "Better than I have in a long time." Her voice carried a small, shy gratitude that made him smile faintly. He gestured toward the dining table. "Breakfast? I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," he said gently. "Please, sit." She hesitated again, but obeyed. The housekeeper had already laid out breakfast: toast, eggs, fruit, and coffee. Ethan sat across from her, watching as she took in the surroundings. His home was elegant but not loud. Clean lines, neutral colors, shelves lined with books and framed photographs of business awards and charity galas. Still, for all its luxury, there was something cold about it, empty, like a museum that had forgotten who it was built for. Lila noticed it too. "It's beautiful here," she said softly, then added almost shyly, "but it feels quiet." Ethan looked at her over his coffee. "Quiet can be peaceful, or lonely," she said, almost whispering. He didn't reply. He couldn't. Her words struck deeper than she knew. After breakfast, he told her she could stay a few days until she found her footing. Lila tried to refuse, but he insisted. "I don't like debts," he said with a half-smile. "Let's call this even for now." She smiled a little, though her eyes said she knew there was more kindness in his gesture than he wanted to admit. As the morning went on, Ethan left for work. His driver met him downstairs, and as he sat in the back seat, he caught himself glancing back at the penthouse window. For some reason, the thought of Lila being there, someone filling that empty space, felt strangely comforting. When he reached the office, the usual chaos greeted him. Assistants scurried about, phones rang, meetings stacked up one after another. He buried himself in the familiar rhythm of control and decision-making. But through all the noise, his mind kept drifting back to the soft voice asking, "May I have your leftovers?" That question replayed again and again. By lunchtime, he found himself staring at his meal without appetite. He pushed his plate away and turned to his assistant, Grace, who was arranging his calendar. "Grace," he said suddenly, "do we have any ongoing outreach projects right now?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "You mean charity?" "Yes, sir. The annual food program starts next month. Move it up," he said. She hesitated. "Sir, the sponsors—" "I'll handle them. Make it happen." Grace nodded, scribbling the note quickly, though her expression remained puzzled. Ethan wasn't known for spontaneous compassion. He donated regularly, yes, but always through official channels. Today, however, there was a new urgency in his tone. That evening when he returned home, the penthouse felt different, warmer. There was a faint smell of soup coming from the kitchen. He followed it and found Lila there, wearing an apron that looked too big for her, standing over the stove. She turned quickly when she saw him. "Oh, I didn't mean to intrude. I just thought you might like something warm." "I can stop if you want." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "You cook?" "A little," she said, blushing. "When I had a place, I used to cook for my younger brother. He's in another city now." Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her stir the pot. The kitchen, usually a sterile place his staff handled, suddenly felt alive. "Smells good," he said. "It's nothing fancy," she replied. "Just chicken soup," he smiled. "Sometimes simple things are the best." They ate together at the small kitchen table instead of the formal dining room. The soup was warm, comforting, and surprisingly delicious. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he wasn't dining alone. After a few quiet minutes, Lila spoke. "I saw the photo in your living room. The one of you and an older man. Was that your father?" Ethan's hand paused mid-air. "Yes," he said after a moment. "He passed away a few years ago. He taught me everything I know about business." She nodded. "You must have been close," he hesitated. "We were once. But success changes people. I drifted away from the things that mattered." Her gaze softened. "It's never too late, you know." He looked up, surprised. "Too late for what?" "To go back," she said quietly. People think success fills you, but sometimes it just covers up what's empty inside. He stared at her, speechless. It was such a simple statement, but it pierced straight through the armor he'd built for years. How could someone who had nothing understand him so completely? Later that night, after Lila went to her room, Ethan sat by the window again, watching the city lights shimmer against the glass. But this time, the silence didn't feel suffocating. For years, he had lived in a world of deals and numbers. Everything had a price. Every action had a motive. But now, because of one small, rain-soaked girl who had asked for leftovers, he was beginning to question everything. He found himself wondering, how many people like her had he passed by, too busy to notice? How many chances to be kind had he ignored? He thought of the men and women who had lost their jobs because of his decisions. He had justified it all as business. But now, those justifications felt hollow. As the clock ticked softly in the background, Ethan made a quiet promise to himself. Tomorrow, he would visit one of the shelters. Not to write a check, but to see, to listen. He didn't know what he was searching for exactly. Redemption, maybe, or a way to feel human again. In the guest room, Lila lay awake too, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't stop thinking about the man who had offered her warmth without asking for anything in return. She had met wealthy people before. Most of them looked right through her, as if she were invisible. But Ethan Cole had seen her. Not just her hunger, but her humanity. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Not because of the expensive sheets or the comfortable bed, but because she felt respected, and as she closed her eyes, she whispered a silent prayer, not for herself, but for him, because she could sense something broken in him too, something that no amount of money could ever fix. Neither of them knew it yet. But that night marked the beginning of something extraordinary, a quiet transformation that would ripple far beyond that penthouse, touching lives neither of them could have imagined. A simple meal, a soft voice, a stranger's kindness, and somewhere in between, the start of a miracle. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the penthouse, casting soft light across the marble floors. Ethan woke earlier than usual, a strange calm settling over him, the kind that had nothing to do with deadlines or business. He made his way to the kitchen, half expecting silence. But as he turned the corner, he saw Lila there again, standing by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 cups. She wore the same modest outfit as before, a simple cream sweater, black trousers, and her hair tied loosely at the back. Nothing about her appearance screamed attention, yet there was something undeniably graceful about her. When she noticed him, she smiled nervously. "Good morning, Mr. Cole. I thought you might like some coffee before heading out." Ethan blinked, surprised. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she said softly, pushing 1 cup toward him. "It's the least I can do." He accepted the cup, the warmth seeping into his fingers. "You know, you don't have to keep doing things to repay me, Lila." She looked down at her hands. "It's not repayment. It just feels nice to be useful again." Her words lingered in the air, heavier than they should have been. Ethan took a sip of coffee, studying her quietly. There was a gentleness in her that the world had clearly tried to take away, yet she still carried it, like a light that refused to go out. As they sat at the breakfast table, Ethan's phone buzzed with a reminder, meeting with the board, 9 a.m. He sighed, setting it aside. "I have to head out soon. Will you be all right here?" Lila nodded. "Of course. I'll just stay out of the way." "Stay as long as you like," he said before grabbing his jacket. But as he walked toward the door, something in him hesitated. "Actually, there's a small charity luncheon later today. It's casual, nothing formal. Would you like to come?" Her eyes widened. "Me to a luncheon?" He smiled faintly. "You could use a change of scenery." She hesitated, clearly torn. "I don't think I belong in a place like that." "Neither do I most days," he said quietly. "But sometimes belonging isn't about who you are, it's about who you choose to stand beside." That line, so effortlessly spoken, seemed to melt away her reluctance. She nodded slowly. "All right. I'll come." Later that afternoon they arrived at the event, a garden terrace at a luxury hotel filled with well-dressed guests and laughter that sounded rehearsed. The crowd greeted Ethan with admiration. After all, he was the man whose business empire employed thousands. But today, he wasn't interested in handshakes or polite flattery. He kept glancing back at Lila, who stood quietly by his side, looking both curious and uneasy. She had borrowed a modest navy blue dress from one of his assistant's friends. It wasn't extravagant, but it suited her perfectly, simple, elegant, and dignified. When a few people asked who she was, Ethan simply replied, "A friend." That single word, friend, made her chest tighten. No one had called her that in years. The event began with speeches about donations, community service, and the importance of compassion. Words that sounded noble but hollow. Lila could sense the emptiness in their tone. The way some guests smiled only for the cameras. As she quietly stepped away to find some air, she overheard two women whispering behind her, "Who's that with Cole?" "Probably some charity case he's sponsoring." Typical. Men like him always need a good deed to polish their reputation. Lila froze, her fingers gripping her purse. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they weren't entirely wrong. Maybe she was a charity case to them. Before she could walk away, Ethan appeared beside her. His eyes flicked to the women, who quickly fell silent and turned away, pretending to chat. "Don't listen to them," he said quietly. Lila looked up, her expression tense. "It's fine. They're not wrong. I don't belong here." Ethan's voice softened. "You belong wherever you choose to stand, Lila. Don't let people who've never struggled decide your worth." She blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in his tone. It wasn't pity, it was respect. He motioned toward the exit. "Come on, let's get out of here." They slipped away before dessert was served. As the car drove through the city, Lila looked out the window, watching people on sidewalks, vendors shouting, children laughing. "Do you ever miss this?" she asked suddenly. He glanced at her. "Miss what?" "Normal life, just walking down the street without anyone knowing who you are. Buying your own lunch. Talking to strangers." Ethan smiled faintly. "I used to love that. Before everything became a schedule. Then why not do it again?" she asked, her tone innocent but direct. He turned back to the window. "Because when you build walls around yourself for too long, you forget where the door is." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful, heavy with things both of them wished they could say. As evening fell, they stopped by a small diner tucked into a quiet corner of the city. The neon sign flickered weakly, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. It wasn't the kind of place someone like Ethan Cole would usually visit. But that was exactly why he wanted to be there. They sat in a booth by the window, and when the waitress came over, Lila ordered with confidence, as if the familiarity of the place had brought her back to life. "2 bowls of soup," she said, smiling. "And an extra piece of bread, please." Ethan chuckled. "You sound like you've been here before. Places like this kept me alive," she said softly. "When I didn't have much, a warm bowl of soup was more than food. It was hope." Ethan watched her, realizing how much he had taken for granted. He had spent years chasing success, measuring life in profits and percentages. Yet this woman, who had lost everything, still found joy in something as small as soup and bread. When the food arrived, they ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing. Her favorite books, his first failed business deal, the feeling of loneliness that followed even the biggest victories. At one point, Lila asked, "What made you stop helping people personally?" "I read about your foundation. It used to be very active." He looked down, stirring his spoon. "I lost someone. After that, I didn't see the point. Helping others felt empty." Her eyes softened. "Who did you lose?" "My sister," he said quietly. "She believed in kindness more than anyone I knew. She was the heart of every project I started. When she died, I thought the world didn't deserve what she tried to give." Lila's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "But maybe that's exactly why you should keep helping. To keep her alive in what you do." Her words struck him deeply. It wasn't the kind of advice that came from pity. It was something purer. When they stepped outside after dinner, the night air was cool. The city buzzed softly around them. Distant traffic, laughter from nearby tables, a faint breeze carrying the smell of rain. For the first time in years, Ethan felt light. They walked in silence for a while until Lila stopped in front of a street musician playing violin. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, and without thinking, Ethan pulled out his wallet. But before he could drop a bill into the case, Lila placed her hand on his. "Not everything needs to be paid for," she said quietly. "Some things are meant to just be felt." He froze, her hand warm against his. Then he nodded slowly, pocketing the money. They stood there for a few minutes, listening. It was in that fleeting moment, amid the noise of the city, the hum of a violin, and the presence of a woman who had nothing but gave everything, that Ethan realized something profound. For years, he had believed miracles were rare, reserved for people who prayed harder or deserved more. But now he saw that miracles were quiet, ordinary moments disguised as second chances. And standing beside Lila, he finally understood. The miracle wasn't that he had saved her, it was that she was saving him. The next morning began quietly, as most mornings did in Ethan's penthouse. The faint hum of the city below, the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. But this morning felt different. There was a softness in the air that Ethan hadn't felt in years, something that made him pause before checking his phone or opening his laptop. He walked toward the balcony, coffee mug in hand, and found Lila sitting cross-legged on a small wooden chair. She was staring out at the skyline, the endless stretch of glass towers glowing under the overcast sky. Her hair fluttered gently in the breeze, and her eyes, though calm, carried a quiet ache. "You're up early," Ethan said, his voice low. Lila smiled faintly without turning around. "I couldn't sleep much. The city looks different from up here." "Different how?" he asked, leaning against the railing. "From the streets, all you see are people rushing, everyone looking down, trying to get somewhere," she said softly. "But from up here it feels like time slows down, like the world can finally breathe." Ethan nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. "I used to come out here every morning," he said, glancing at the view. "Back when I thought success was measured by how high you could climb. And now," he hesitated, "now I think it's about how long you can stay human while climbing." Lila turned to face him, her gaze steady. "That's harder than it sounds." "It is," he agreed quietly. They stood there in silence for a while, the sound of the city faint but constant beneath them. It was Lila who finally broke the stillness. "Ethan, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She turned back to the skyline. "Why did you help me that day?" "You didn't even know me." Ethan took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Because you looked at me like I was a person. Not a name, not a headline, not a CEO. I hadn't seen that look in a long time." Lila blinked, taken aback. "Most people help because they feel sorry." He shook his head. "The pity fades. Recognition doesn't." Her eyes softened at that. There was something disarming about the way he said things, like each word had been weighed carefully before it left his mouth. A few hours later, Ethan drove her across town to an office building she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't his corporate headquarters or a business tower. It was smaller, warmer, and surrounded by trees. A small brass plaque outside read, "The Marshall Foundation for Community Renewal." "This was my sister's idea," Ethan said as they stepped inside. "We built it years ago. She wanted to help people restart their lives, those who lost jobs, homes, direction, themselves." Lila's eyes widened as she looked around. The walls were covered in framed photographs, smiling families, workshops in progress, volunteers serving meals. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It was," Ethan said. "But after she passed, I couldn't come here anymore. The programs kept running, but I stopped showing up. I didn't want to feel what she used to make me feel, that the world was still good." Lila turned to him. "Maybe that's what you need to feel again." He looked at her, really looked at her, at the way her presence seemed to fill the room with quiet strength. "You sound just like her," he murmured. She smiled sadly. "I wish I'd known her." "Me too." he said softly. As they walked through the building, they met volunteers sorting clothes and serving lunch to visitors. One woman in her late 60s recognized Ethan instantly. "Mr. Cole, it's been years," she exclaimed warmly. "Your sister would be so happy to see you back." Ethan smiled awkwardly. "Just visiting," he said, but the woman shook her head. "You never just visit kindness, sir. You either live it or you don't." Her words hung between them, echoing long after she walked away. Later that day, Lila found herself sitting with a group of women who were part of a skills training program. They were teaching sewing and small business management to others who had lost their jobs. The moment she sat down, they welcomed her like family, and soon she was laughing, sharing stories, and stitching small pieces of fabric into something beautiful. Ethan stood in the corner, watching her. For the first time, he saw what his sister must have seen in people, not weakness, but resilience, not struggle, but survival. When Lila noticed him watching, she waved him over. Come on," she called out. "You look like you've never used a needle before." He chuckled. "That's because I haven't." The group laughed, handing him a piece of fabric. "Then it's time you learn," one of the women said. Ethan sat beside Lila and awkwardly tried to thread the needle. She leaned closer to guide his hands, their fingers brushing lightly. He froze for a moment, not because of the touch itself, but because it felt so natural, so unguarded. When he finally managed to stitch a crooked line, the women applauded, and Lila grinned. "Not bad for a first-timer," she teased. He smiled back. "Don't let it go to your head. I'm still the boss here." Her laughter was soft, genuine, a sound he hadn't realized he missed in his life until now. By the time the afternoon sun faded, Ethan felt something shift inside him. For years, he had lived behind glass walls, protecting himself from connection, from feeling too deeply. But today, watching Lila, a woman who had nothing yet still gave everything of her heart, he felt those walls begin to crack. As they drove back home, the city lights flickered outside the car windows. Lila looked out quietly, lost in thought. "Do you miss your old life?" Ethan asked gently. She hesitated. "Sometimes. Not the poverty, but the people. There's a kind of honesty that comes from having nothing. When you're poor, you don't pretend, you just survive." He nodded. "I've met a lot of rich people who are poor in ways money can't fix." She smiled faintly. "You're not one of them anymore." He looked at her curiously. "Oh, what makes you say that?" "Because you're learning how to see again," she said softly. "And once you learn to really see people, you can't go back to being blind." Her words hit him harder than she realized. When they reached the penthouse, the air was cool and still. Lila stood by the window, watching the lights of the city below, while Ethan lingered by the doorway. He wanted to say something that could explain what she had brought back into his life, but words felt too small for it. Instead, he walked up beside her, both of them looking out at the city. "You know," he said after a long pause, "you've done more for me in a few days than anyone has in years." Lila turned her head slightly, her eyes glistening in the soft light. "All I did was remind you of who you already were." He smiled, a quiet warmth spreading across his face. "Then maybe that's what miracles are, reminders." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. A message from his assistant. "Media request. They found out about the woman you brought to the charity center." His chest tightened. The world outside, the one he'd tried to keep away, was already creeping in. Lila noticed the change in his expression. "What's wrong?" he sighed. "The press. They think I'm trying to stage some kind of publicity stunt." Her shoulders dropped slightly. "Maybe I should go then. I don't want to cause trouble for you." He turned to her, voice firm but gentle. "You're not the problem, Lila. The world just doesn't know how to understand genuine things anymore." For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "Stay, please." She looked at him, searching his face, and saw no trace of pity, only sincerity. Slowly she nodded. That night, long after the city fell silent, Ethan sat awake by his desk. On it lay a photograph of his late sister, smiling beside a group of volunteers. He traced a finger across the frame and whispered, "You were right." There's still good in the world. And just behind him, in the soft reflection of the window, he could see Lila asleep on the couch, peaceful, safe, and somehow the beginning of everything he didn't know he was missing. Morning sunlight spilled gently across the penthouse windows, painting the marble floor in soft gold. The air was still and peaceful, but inside Ethan's chest a quiet storm brewed. He had barely slept. The message from his assistant about the press had ignited something he couldn't ignore. The outside world was coming, and this fragile human peace he'd built with Lila was about to be tested. He stepped into the living room, where Lila was already awake, folding the blanket she had used on the couch. Her hair was messy, her eyes still heavy from sleep. Yet there was something graceful about her presence, like she belonged, even in a place as cold and sterile as his penthouse. "You're up early again," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "Old habit? When you've lived without much, you learn to wake up with the world." Ethan nodded, trying to return her smile. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, walking toward the kitchen. "The media found out about you, about us. They think this is some kind of charity act, the Millionaire helping the poor woman for good PR. Lila's hands froze mid-fold. Oh, he could see the flicker of sadness in her eyes, the kind that tried to hide itself but couldn't. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to make trouble for you." "Don't," he said quickly. "You didn't do anything wrong. They just don't know the truth." "And what is the truth?" she asked quietly. He exhaled slowly. "That I didn't save you. You saved me." For a long moment they stood in silence, two souls bound by something deeper than circumstance. But the peace didn't last. By afternoon, Ethan's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted statements, tabloids were running exaggerated headlines, and investors were asking questions. His assistant, Miranda, came up to the penthouse with a concerned look. "You need to issue a press release, Ethan," she said. "They're saying you've lost focus, that you're getting distracted." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Distracted from what? Being human?" Miranda hesitated. "You know that's not what I meant." "But the board?" "I don't care what the board thinks," he interrupted sharply. Then, catching the tension in the air, he sighed and softened his tone. "Miranda, she's not some project. She's a person, and I won't let them turn her into a headline." Lila was standing by the door, listening. When Miranda left, she walked up to him slowly. "Maybe she's right," she said quietly. "You have a life, Ethan, a world that depends on you. I shouldn't be part of that." He turned to her, frustration flickering in his eyes. "You think walking away will make this better?" "It'll make it easier," she said, her voice trembling. "For both of us." Ethan stepped closer. "Easier isn't always right, Lila." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "Sometimes it's the only way to survive." And before he could say another word, she walked toward her room and closed the door. That night, the penthouse felt emptier than ever. The silence stretched on like a ghost. Ethan sat alone, scrolling through news articles, pictures of him and Lila leaving the charity center, wild headlines twisting their story into something it wasn't. He closed his laptop and leaned back, eyes stinging with exhaustion. He thought about the first day he met her, that small voice asking for leftovers, those tired yet kind eyes that had seen too much but still carried hope. Somewhere along the way, she had reminded him of everything he had lost: humility, connection, and the simple act of caring. He stood up suddenly and walked to her room. The door was slightly open. Inside, he saw her sitting by the window, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the city lights. She didn't turn when he entered. "I used to come here every night," she said softly, "when I lived on the streets. I'd look at these same lights and tell myself one day I'd be on the other side of the glass. But I never imagined it'd feel so lonely." Ethan moved closer, his voice low. "You're not alone anymore." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "You don't know that. Once the noise gets too loud, people leave." "They always do." He crouched beside her. "Then I'll be the one who doesn't." For a long moment she just stared at him, searching his face for the truth. Then, without a word, she leaned her head gently against his shoulder, They stayed like that for what felt like hours, the city glowing silently beyond the glass. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He called Miranda. "Set up a press conference," he said firmly. "I'm going to tell them everything." Miranda hesitated. "Everything?" "Yes," he said. "The truth." That afternoon, Ethan stood before a room full of flashing cameras and microphones. The air was thick with anticipation. Lila stood quietly at the back, her hands clasped tightly. When the reporters began shouting questions, Ethan raised a hand. "Before you ask," he said calmly, "let me explain." The room fell silent. 2 weeks ago, I met someone who reminded me of who I used to be. Someone who showed me that kindness isn't charity and compassion isn't weakness. I didn't help her for publicity. I helped her because she reminded me of my sister who dedicated her life to helping others. Somewhere along the way I forgot what mattered. She helped me remember. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked rapidly. But Ethan didn't waver. "This isn't a story about a rich man saving a poor woman," he continued. "It's about how a simple act, a request for leftovers, changed a man who thought he had everything." He looked directly at the reporters. "If you want to print a headline, print this. A woman with nothing gave a millionaire back his humanity." Lila's eyes welled with tears. The room erupted in whispers and flashes, but she barely noticed. After the conference, Ethan found her waiting outside. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied. "Because people deserve to know the truth. About you, about kindness, about what really matters." She looked at him for a long moment before stepping closer. "You're not the same man I met that day," he smiled faintly. "I could say the same about you." For the next few weeks, the story spread, but not the way the tabloids expected. The world was moved by Ethan's honesty, by the sincerity of his words. People began donating to the foundation again. Others shared their own stories of kindness, of small miracles sparked by compassion, and through it all, Ethan and Lila worked side by side at the foundation. She started helping organize programs for women looking to rebuild their lives. Her laughter filled the halls. Her presence brought warmth to every corner. One afternoon, as they watched volunteers serve meals, Lila turned to him and said, "You know, I used to think miracles were something that happened to you." He looked at her curiously. "And now?" "Now I think miracles happen through you," she said softly. "When you choose to care." He smiled, a quiet peace settling over him. "Then you were my miracle, Lila." She blushed slightly, looking away. Maybe we were each other's. The years that followed changed both of them. Ethan's company grew, but so did his heart. He split his time between the corporate world and the foundation, always returning to where it all began, the people who reminded him why he started. And Lila, she never went back to the streets. Instead, she became the heart of the foundation, helping others find hope the same way she once did. Sometimes, when the day ended and the city lights shimmered outside, they'd sit together quietly, sharing stories, laughter, and the occasional silence that said more than words ever could. One evening, as they closed the foundation for the night, Ethan turned to her and said, "Funny, isn't it? How something as small as leftovers could change everything." Lila smiled, her eyes glowing softly. "That's the thing about kindness," she said. "It never stays small." And as they stepped outside, two souls who had found light in each other's brokenness, the world seemed a little softer, a little brighter, and infinitely more human. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional stories that celebrate humanity and compassion. Tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment where a small act of kindness changed everything? Your story might inspire someone today. Stay connected for more soul-stirring tales that remind us of the beauty still left in this world.